Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now you'll notice the spinny thing today is not spinning because it's much easier to show you the effect of a quickly painted regiment of fodder for Turnip28 in this way. Now Turnip28 is designed by Max Fitzgerald. It's a free game. I'll pop a bunch of links in the description so you can go check out more about it. It is a post-apocalyptic retro... Explaining it would take me half the time of the video, so go check it out because it's an absolute blast and it encourages going a bit mental with your miniatures. So I'm going to show you a couple of things as we get started, but as always, all the paints for this one will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So what I've got here are a few 3D prints of official Turnip28 miniatures. Now these are available both as STLs, and I'll pop links in the description to where you can grab these, but you can also get them printed through third parties. There's a few of those. However, if you don't have a printer, there is a huge section in the Swollen Maglet, which is the magazine that accompanies Turnip28. And in there is just a massive section on conversion and how to build regiments kind of similar to this using ordinary plastic kits. It's really wonderful, and it is how most of the turnip regiments out there got started. So, like I said, don't worry if you don't have a printer, you're not going to be missing out. I mean, the maglet even contains shopping lists for stuff to go looking for. It's that specific. All the same, the printed miniatures are very cool, and I love this kind of mad Jim Henson Napoleonic feel to them. They're just wonderful. But they are lacking a little something that the converted miniatures you usually see do have. And that is this gross, wiry texture, stuff growing out of the troops, because the root that's sort of gnawing at the foundation of the earth, it is mutating and consuming people. And so lots of these unfortunates have stuff growing out of them. And that's what's missing, I would say, from some of these miniatures. Luckily, it is the easiest thing in the world to add. So, what I have, this is a set of tufts. They're from the Army Painter, and I didn't really have much use for them when I picked them up. They turned out to be a little bit too bright for the project I had in mind. Luckily, they've got a new lease of life here. Now, individually, they are still quite large to just stick to your turnip troops. So what I'm going to do is just take my blade, nice sharp scalpel, and just slice through a few of them, cutting the bigger ones in half. The little ones, you can use these as little spot detailers too. The larger ones that you get on these, I'm going to cut into quarters. But yeah, nothing more complex than this. Just slice up some of these tufts into more manageable sections. Get rough with it if you have to. Really rough. Then just a little bit of super glue on the little plastic backing paper that's still there. And let's go ahead and jam that quite roughly, growing up from out of his shoulders and over his back there. Now the thing to bear in mind with these is that once they are on and glued in place, they're going to look like they're bursting out of whatever they're touching. So they don't have to be in particularly logical spots. Like even if I were to stick one coming out of, his stomach here, yes, he's wearing a chest piece, but the grass will obscure where the hole should be. So don't worry too much, just stick him anywhere it looks cool. Go nuts with the tufts. And there we have it, easy as that. It's not going to look like much yet, but once we take them out and prime these guys, it's going to mat all of that together, and it will look pretty cool. So, speaking of, let's take them outside. I'm going to prime these guys in black. Let's see what we get. You'll see how almost straight away, the priming really makes those tufts stick to these guys and kind of just blend in. Oh God, that's gross. Anyhow, the very first step I'm actually going to take here, this is German Camo Black Brown. You can use any dark brown, something like Dryad Bark or Rhinox Hide. It doesn't matter too much. All I'm going to do is very quickly blast over the entire miniature, even jab it into the tufts a little, because as much as possible I want to get rid of the black. Now, if you find a really deep brown primer, all the better, but I've never found anything that quite matches what I want. And I want to get rid of unnatural black. Like, black does not look realistic. And I'm aware realism when painting horribly infected turnip guys is probably not #1 concern, but I am thinking about it. So brown these guys up now. Now once that's dried, what we're going to do is grab a big soft brush. I'm using one of my makeup brushes, but a dry brush or similar will also work quite well for this. I'm going to load it up with a mid-tone brown. Now here I'm using leather brown from the Army Painter, but it could as easily be, I don't know, beige brown or German camo medium brown from Vallejo. What else is there? Mornfang brown. It doesn't really matter all that much. What we're going to do now is fairly generously overbrush them. This is going to be our true mid-tone. So we're leaving grimy brown in the recesses. I think very quickly you'll see, okay, this is where we're getting kind of the shape of these yucky boys. That's one done. I'll do the others now real quick. Now we've got scads of texture, looks really grimy, and you'll see quite a few people will actually stop painting almost here. Anyhow, we're going to continue. I have here lead belcher, and I'm going to brush this fairly quickly over the metallic parts. See, I'm not too worried if I do leave a little bit in those recesses there. Rough is good. The rougher the better, I would say. Now once you've done the fronts, the breastplates and what have you, just spin them around and make sure anything on the pack which you want to paint in, you do that too. Not all the packs are going to have accessories and what have you, but take a quick look. What I've got now is ash grey from the Army Painter. Now a lot of folks will leave the trousers in the gnarly brown or black or whatever because they're going to make them messy as later on. But I want my guys to look like they've actually chanced into some uniform. So ash grey on the trousers, and you'll see it covers extremely well for such a light grey. Now for a solid grey like that, it is going to require a second coat, but the first doesn't let very much of the primer show through, so depending on how ratty you want them to look, you might like that. What I've got now, this is Imperial Navy from the Army Painter, and this you'll see covers very, very nicely. I'm going to paint over their jackets with this. Cantor blue, ultramarine blue, anything of the sort. I kind of discovered quite by accident I was more or less painting them French. So if you want to see me paint really grimy French infantry, well, here's how I do that. You can be fairly messy with that because straight after the blue we're applying the red, and we'll use Mephiston red here. It ends up in some places as a tidy up stage, so if you have splurged over some of these bits with your blue, don't worry. So I'm doing the turnbacks, do his cuffs with this as well. Now on most of these figures, they've got this bandana thing around the neck. One really cool thing I have seen people do is to use that as like a facing color for each regiment. I'm just going to paint it white later on, but if you wanted to, you could dab it in red here, or give it a yellow or an orange or something, for a facing color. Now, for the parts that we want to be white, I'm not going to use a true white because look at these guys. Instead, what I'm using, this is Dorado Skin from Army Painter. It is a very, very pale skin tone, so something like Pallid Witch Flesh would probably match this from the Citadel range. I'm going to use this to paint in their neckerchief things, the trim on their cuffs and the like, and as well any of the root vegetables that they are carrying. Like these guys, for example, these look more like parsnips or carrots or something, but if you base coat them now with this not quite white, they'll be easier to top up with another color later. Now, as well as the bits and pieces on the miniature here, I have also done that skull mask on one of the other fellas with a quick coat of this too. Now I'm going to paint that skeleton bone later, but of course those little oddments and whatnots, you can decide what you're going to do with them. Now, after telling my camera to focus, I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey on the packs here. What I'd suggest, I had thought about using something like Vallejo's blue-grey pale, like a sort of a sky blue, sea blue sort of finish, but I used this on my test pieces and quite liked how it came out. So because I do want to do a mostly uniform regiment, this is what I'm going to use. But it's bedrolls, it's great coats, so you can paint them anything you want. Now I'm going to use XV88 on the water bottles. I had used something else on the other ones, but it took a couple of coats, and this is much simpler. Now we are starting to get a little into the weeds on purely optional here. And what I'm going to do is use Mornfang Brown to quickly blast over some of the wooden details on the muskets. Just come up close to any metalwork. This doesn't need to be perfect. I just want to brighten up more prominent parts of it. Now I've got here, this is Vallejo Silver Grey, and this is the closest that I'm going to get to true white on these guys. And I'm going to use this just to paint in the cross belts. Okay, now we're really getting into the home stretch. The last thing that I'm going to do at this point for most of these guys is to apply some German grey anywhere that's going to be black. Now you can blacken their shoes here if you fancy, but I would thoroughly suggest don't bother. You're going to smack so much muck and mire onto the bottom of them, it's not going to matter all that much. It will probably disappear. Almost done. Goodness me, what am I on about? What I have is iron rack skin, and I'm going to paint in their hands. I actually did the other fellows, my test pieces, with a mixed color, and discovered only afterwards it was basically iron rack skin, so just going to use it this time. Yeah, that's looking proper yucky. What I've got now is greedy gold, and I'm going to dot in relatively carefully the buttons on his collar, his cuff rather. Now I'm not too worried if I do splurge over a little here, because the shade that we're going to use is going to hide some of these sins. Now at last I've got US Dark Green from Vallejo, although any grimy green will work. Death Guard green springs to mind. And I've watered this down roughly half and half with water because I want this to run similarly to a shade, but not be so runny that it just goes everywhere when I apply it. I do want it to be kind of between a shade and a paint. So take your time and be relatively careful here, painting in, the bristles of these grimy little tufts. Now once you're confident that has dried, we're going to now dry brush the entire miniature. Now I'm using here, this is Ancient Stone from Army Painter, but anything like ivory, pale sand, it's up to you. It doesn't need to be any specific color. We're just looking for something to very lightly catch the edges of all of this detail. And take your time here, and you really want to make sure you don't have much on your brush, because in this instance, adding more is easy, but taking it off if you've applied too much, that's a little bit trickier. So you can even dry brush the tips of your yucky grass. But yeah, concentrating on areas of detail where there is a bit of an edge. Away we go. I am going to dry brush all of these guys. Now before you apply the wash or shade, whatever you're using, make sure that these guys have dried thoroughly, particularly that green that we've worked into all of the little nooks and crannies of the tufts. That stuff will stay wet for a while if you're not careful. But once it is dry, what I'm going to use is Umber Wash from Vallejo Game Color. This looks pretty funky going on. It's got an almost muddy texture to it. And this is part of the reason why it's going to work so well with that all over, that stone color we used. Because the mucky muddiness, it's going to just tie it all together. Once you've gone around and blapped on a quick layer of this, give it a few seconds to sort of settle and start spreading around. And then you can determine, okay, I want to shift it away from this bit, for example. But yeah, the entire miniature, same as always. Let's get some brown grime on them. You can also use Agrex Earthshade or anything that you've got. I just like this because the umber wash has a real brown quality to it that settles in the recesses, and it kind of paints things brown in a way that some of the other shades don't really. Now once that has dried thoroughly, you'll have something that looks like this. And man, oh man, I love how grungy and grimy it is. Over the right colors, that Vallejo Game Color Umber Wash, my goodness, it just does the job, It is really, really grim. But what we're going to do now, like from here, you could very easily pop them on the table, give them his base, and call them done. But I want to take things a little further, so let's have some fun. Now for this stage, ordinarily I'd recommend you could turn to something like Red Leather from Vallejo, or Scrag Brown from Citadel, and just thin it down to give you a rusty effect. But today I'm actually using, this is a Light Rust from Green Stuff World, part of their liquid pigment range. And yeah, it's exactly what it says on the tin. I'm using it mostly for the convenience factor of I don't have to thin out the paint. So little driblets of this in areas where you want, rust to collect or be streaking, make it look proper grimy. You can even dab it onto a flat surface and then just tap it with your finger to give you a fairly random effect to it. So a lot of fun playing around with this. But like I said, you can just as easily use a paint. Then, once that joyful mess has dried, grab yourself the brightest silver that you've got. Now I'm using here, this is steel from Vallejo's Model Air range. Just a tiny bit of this on your brush at a time. I'm going to make sure I haven't got too much actually. Just touch at some of the edges where you want it to look as though it's recently caught a bit of damage. So using the edge of your brush in some places. You don't need to do very much of this. And the more of it you add, the more recent this damage is going to look. So be fairly sparing with it. Now we're going to go back to ancient stone to highlight something incredibly important, the root vegetables. Now at the moment most of these are still going to be like quite a plain white, but with a little bit of ancient stone, just horizontal lines to give these a bit of texture. Up around the top, be careful, but brighten them up because that's going to matter if you want to make them actual turnips. Now this is going to be much more visible on some miniatures than others. What I've got here, this is Magos Purple. This is quite a translucent contrast color. And of course, anything here that you can turn purple is going to work. Take blue and red, mix them together, thin them out a bit, but just a wee splash of, oh God, Magos Purple. It looks so vile. Anywhere that you've got the head of a turnip visible, just splash a little bit of this on for visual interest and you'll have a turnip. Yum. Now having done that, I realize I've actually acted slightly out of order here. What I should have done first is grab my Deepkin Flesh and highlight the backs of these fingers to make them look a little lighter. And then comes the Magos Purple to touch in the turnips and any little like pustules and nodules on the backs of their hands. Just a dot of this to make them look a bit more neepy. Now you can use whatever color, pick a color suited to the root vegetable that your horrid little cult worships. Maybe even red if you're some of those radish heretics from up Buford Abbey. And then go back to your lead belcher, and any buttons which haven't been painted in, you can dot those in now. So on all of the turnbacks, I've left the buttons to last, and any buttons on gaiters and what have you, you can touch those in as well. Now I promised I was going to demonstrate the basing. So now that we've done the painting side of things, you could of course carry on highlighting them, but it's up to you. I'm going to start off with a thin layer here of, this is Stirland Mud. Any texture paint will do as long as it's dark and grimy. Just a thin layer because all I want to do is add a little bit of the grit to the base to start with. And do not worry if this ends up on his boots. or his trousers. And then on go a couple of tufts. Now I'm using here, I actually don't remember which variety these are, but they are from the Army Painter. Just pick something you like the look of. Now here comes the fun part. More mud! You really are going to start jamming it on now. Rub it all over and work it into the tufts. You don't worry too much if you will see a little bit of the original color showing through, but you want to make it look hench is the word. Really work it in there and put a little bit more of this so you get a little bit of variation in height on your base. And then this is going to take a little bit longer to dry. So pop it somewhere. It's going to be safe and let that junk settle. So once that has dried and hardened, you'll have this awful clodgy looking mess. Perfect. Now I'm going to turn here, this is flat brown from Vallejo. I like this because it's got kind of a sickly yellow cast to it. Lightly dry brush over the base and over the mud on the tufts as well. Then what you can do is, without taking quite so much off of your brush, just lightly stipple with your raggedy brush up on trousers and legs and what have you to make them look a little more grimy. And then comes the varnish. Now I'm using here Ardcoat. This is the Citadel Gloss Varnish. I like this one because it's nice and gloopy and it will stay where I put it. So put down a layer of this. I like to put it at the base of where the tufts are because I kind of figure that's where most water is going to collect and settle. So you don't want to cover the entire base in this, just a few select patches to make certain areas look properly moist. Now, bearing in mind this sort of bluey translucent muck, it will become clear once it's properly dried. So I'm going to pop this aside to let that happen. And once it is, I'll paint the base rim with a nice dark brown, and these guys will be ready. So let's get a look at the turnip regiment as it's finished. And so there, with some of those that I've finished already, our Turnip28 troops are complete. And I've got another 4 to finish off before I can call this unit of fodder complete, because they're 12 miniatures a pop. They're a blast to paint though. These guys really, they give me the vibe of like Jim Henson and Brian Froud, you know, Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, kind of coming together to do a Napoleonic army film. Still somehow more accurate than Ridley Scott's, but I digress. I do thoroughly recommend go ahead and pick up the rules. They're cheap as free, and there's a bunch of neat STLs if you have got a printer, which are also available for free. But like I said, half the fun isn't going to be converting your miniatures, so whether you've got a printer or not, this is going to be a blast. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, and very importantly resin in this case, as well as my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. You really are what makes this channel possible. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all. And yeah, go eat your greens.